And joining me now is David Eisenbach, a professor of history at Columbia University who challenged Tish James in the 2017 Democratic primary for public advocate. And he's running under the Stop Rebney party line.
That's right.
So I guess before we get into anything else, what does that mean?
Right. Rebney is the real estate board of New York. And my challenge is that we have now the wholesale corruption of the city council and the mayor's office. We have numerous corruption scandals involving the mayor, and it all centers around real estate. And the big problem that I see in New York City is that we are selling out our neighborhoods to big real estate, and that is why I'm the anti-Rebney
Okay,
party.
so that's what Stop Rebney means. That's the ballot line. You're running for public advocate in the special election. We'll come back to that in a minute.
Sure.
You are a professor.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your resume, anything you want to name that you've done in public service, how being a professor prepares you to be a public advocate.
Well, I'm a historian. I teach U.S. presidential history. And I think we're in a historic moment where the city is going on an unsustainable path, where we are losing the middle class, where we are losing long-term residents. We have record displacement, record homelessness. And I do see that the real estate industry is the cause of this.
So what's your assessment of where the city is right now? You've spoken about it a little bit there, obviously, but how do you generally capture this moment in time? As a historian, you probably have a perspective on that. Where is New York City right now?
Right. Well, we're at a critical moment where we have, just like much of the American economy, become an economy of the 1%, where we are building luxury towers all around the city. This is causing landlords to jack up the rents on middle-class people, working New Yorkers who are just trying to get by. And we're losing it. We're losing the city. When you walk around town, you see empty storefronts after empty storefronts. Something doesn't make sense in a city allegedly awash in cash. It looks like the 1970s out there. And the reason for this is real estate speculation, and that's something I've been battling against with the Small Business Job Survival Act.
We'll come back to that in a second, but crime is very low, relatively speaking. There's a lot of employment. The city is building more and more affordable housing. There are certain ways where some of what you describe and others in this race and elsewhere doesn't seem to really match up with the reality of the city at large. How do you square that?
There's something out of sync with what's going on. I mean, Donald Trump is president for a reason. He's president because he was voicing this notion that while you have a lot of winners, right, the 1% winning, right, for the regular middle class, we are left behind. Our wages have now stagnated. We have mountains and mountains of debt that is growing, and we are just feeling squeezed. And that is the perspective I'm bringing to New York City. I mean, that is the fact. We are on this unsustainable path, both as a country and as a city.
So you're running to be the public advocate, citywide elected official, second in line to the mayor. What does the public advocacy look like if you're successful on February 26th? What is, you come into office, how are you running that office, and what is the mission under your leadership?
Right. Well, I want to bring advocates into the public advocate's office. I want to restructure it so that we have advocates who are dedicated, who have already dedicated their lives in some cases to specific issues. So, for example, somebody in charge of people with disabilities advocacy, somebody in charge of animal rights, somebody in charge of small business, so that specifically when somebody makes a phone call to my office to make a complaint or ask for some help, they'll know exactly where to go.
And so what is that? Is that all sort of reactive, as you're indicating? It's calls to the office, and so you're responding to complaints and concerns, or are there other things you're doing?
It goes both ways, of course, right? So on one hand, the public advocate's office is the ombudsman, right? We are supposed to be taking the public's complaints and then using this bully pulpit to shine a spotlight on them for the public. The other is to initiate our own inspections, our own complaints, and our own initiatives.
So what are some areas that you'd look at? I mean, you named a couple of areas you'd bring advocates in on. You also obviously are talking about real estate. What are your focus areas, or do you not you want to wait and see?
No. I definitely have two major initiatives. One is on this question of affordable housing and how are we making the city more affordable. I was an opponent. The reason why I ran in 2017 as an anti-de Blasio Democrat is because I'm against these rezonings and this affordable housing program, which is really just a way of justifying the building of luxury towers with just a little bit of affordable in neighborhoods. So what we've seen is the transformation of affordable neighborhoods like East Harlem, like Inwood, Washington Heights, into less affordable and what will be unaffordable neighborhoods. As soon as you start building luxury towers in an affordable neighborhood, the surrounding landlords start to jack up their rents. That's what leads to the displacement.
And so what do you do? What's a public advocate, Eisenbach, do about that?
So what I would do is, first off, we have to reform the Euler process, the whole process by which we approve these rezonings, so that when a community board votes against a project, that's the end of the story. If we had had that veto power on the part of community boards, we would have stopped the rezoning of Inwood. We would have stopped the rezoning of East Harlem.
Some people would say nothing would ever happen. I mean, almost nothing would change about neighborhoods, and some of the gentrification that we've seen was already happening anyway in some of these areas that have been rezoned. Maybe not quite East New York where there was a rezoning, but East Harlem and Inwood. How would you respond to that? I mean, community boards are infamous for voting no on things, right?
Well, I was involved with the fight against the Inwood rezoning, and it wasn't a fight against entirely rezoning. There was a community plan, and the same thing with the tech hub in the East Village. There was a community plan. And we had these city council members that said they were going to fight for the community plan, but they wound up rolling along with the Rebney plan. And so this is the problem, is that when we have the communities the way it is now, they just have an advisory role. So even when community boards vote against a project, right, it still is going to go forward. They have no leverage to force the administration and the city council to consider their plan. And if you gave community boards the veto, they would force the community, the city council to take the community's rezoning plan over the real estate industry.
And what are some key elements of a real community rezoning? I mean, you talk about some of these favor too much just more development that includes a portion of affordable housing, but these plans also very often include tens of millions of dollars in investments in neighborhoods, some more green space, new school seats, some of those other things. So what's the missing picture?
My frustration with that is that it's like you can't have a STEM program in Inwood unless you pass this rezoning. You can't have extra green space unless you
take the extra housing,
right? You have to take this spoonful of sugar with the medicine. Well, what I say is, why can't Inwood, why can't East Harlem have these things, have these education programs, have these environmental programs, have these green space programs without having to take all these luxury towers that are going to lead to the displacement of long-term residents?
So when you're running the public advocate's office, if you're successful, you talk about taking in complaints, but also doing investigations, shining a spotlight. What does that look like? Take us inside a day or a week inside of your public advocacy. Should we expect just lots of sort of screaming press conferences outside of a building or where a rezoning is planned, or are there other things at play too?
Well, it's a mix, right? For example, what I've done in helping to lead the crusade on the Small Business Job Survival Act, right? I basically have kind of taken over this bill that has been kicking around the city council for 33 years. And I did it through a mix. Yes, it means getting in the face of a city council member. Yes, you get in front of the cameras and you raise a big show about it. But you also work behind the scenes and you work in negotiation and discussion. And I've been working with Corey Johnson's office so that we get the strongest bill possible.
So folks should just quickly should know, some are familiar probably, but the Small Business Job Survival Act is trying to reform the way that commercial leasing is done in the city.
That's right.
To favor tenants, especially small businesses, more than they have in their leverage with landlords now.
Exactly, because commercial tenants have no rights. That's why we're seeing, these empty storefronts all over. But if they had some rights in the negotiation process, they could stay in their space, and the whole city could thrive.
And that bill has been changed to move away from more strict commercial rent control to be a little bit looser about negotiations around leases and how that happens. Would you prefer the older version, which is a version of basically commercial rent control?
Well, I think also this gets into my whole philosophy. You get done what you can get done. It's important that we get this bill passed right now. And if we can expand it, if we can elaborate on it down the line, that's great. But the fact of the matter is, this has been a fight since Ruth Messenger initiated this bill and submitted this bill back in 1986, right? And now we're on the precipice of finally passing what could be the grounding of protections on small business that can expand from there. And I think it's just reflective of my approach, which is a combination of the inside-outside game. I think that that's how a public advocate needs to approach the office, so that you're not just yelling and screaming, although that's part of it, but you're also working with the politicians to get something passed.
As public advocate, you'd have the ability to introduce legislation. You don't get a vote in the city council, but other than the Small Business Job Survival Act, which is already there,
right,
are there other things you'd look to legislate on? Do you have a legislative agenda at this point?
Yes, to reform that ULURP process to give community boards veto power over rezonings. You know, just this past week, Community Board 2 voted against the rezoning that would allow for Elizabeth Street Garden to be converted into a tower. And that, again, under my bill, under the change that I would make, would mean that an end of the discussion about giving away that precious green space, Elizabeth Street Garden.
Okay, and we might see some reforms to ULURP through the Charter Revision Commission that's actually doing its work this year.
And I look forward to that, and as public advocate, I would definitely want to press for big changes in the ULURP process.
If you're public advocate come February 27th, you will be tasked with oversight of Mayor Bill de Blasio. You've mentioned him briefly earlier. You feel like he's been too friendly to real estate, and the rezonings have not been what communities really need in your view. Are there other things where you either want to give the mayor some credit, some other things that you'd want to take him to task on? You'd at least have the rest of this year to be holding this mayor accountable.
Yeah. Well, I have a big problem with Bill de Blasio's plans on education. To change the testing for the specialized high schools and the entrance requirements is not the way in which we're going to get at the real problem of educational disparity, which is a serious problem. The fact of the matter is that we're not adequately preparing every child in New York City to compete for the specialized high schools. And this is particularly the case in communities of color. So when you have the passing rates on the science and the math and the English exams in these community schools that are lower than 20%, that is a dismal failure. And the solution for the lack of diversity in the specialized high schools is not to mess with the entrance requirements or the test. It's to fix the community-based schools.
Okay, how?
Well, that's going to require a lot more time, money, and effort than you can just sort of, you know, with the blink of an eye, you know, fix some diversity. It requires actually calling out the teachers' unions and the principals in some cases. And the ultimate solution is you got to reduce class size. You're a former teacher yourself, right? You know that if you have 32 kids, 35 kids in a classroom, you cannot possibly provide the individualized attention necessary. You got to bring that class size down. Requires a lot more money and investment.
So that would be at the top of your list for solutions, and that might require a pretty massive investment in a capital budget plan to build out schools and build out seats, but that's something that you would try to push
That's
forward.
right. It's going to require a big fight because it's a fight over funding at that point. And we have to make sure that the funds go into the right directions.
As a historian, do you see any problem with how the city has been going over the last 5+ years with a Democratic mayor and a city council that's almost exclusively Democrats? Is there any issue there? I mean, I know you're a Democrat, but is that a problem? Is divided government sometimes more productive? Have you seen any issues with the fact that there's almost too much alignment in philosophy?
Well, I think yes, I absolutely, and I think that when you have, you know, a system without any checks and balances, you're inevitably going to have issues of corruption and inefficiency. And I think the public advocate's job should be just as the watchdog, who's going to call them as you see them, And you can't do that if your ambition is to become mayor. You're going to have to compromise your ideals. You're going to have to, avoid stepping on the toes of the most powerful people, including the most powerful people in your own party. And I have already said I don't want to be mayor. I just want to be public advocate, and I'm going to have no problem calling out anybody in the city government.
So last question in the time we have. You are running against several elected officials, quite a few, city council members, assembly members, even the former speaker of the city council. Is your pitch to voters that they shouldn't go with the government experience because there's a problem there? How do you differentiate yourself with those folks who do have that experience and they say, here's what I've done in government and now I can take the next step?
Well, look at their record in government. They rezoned East Harlem. They rezoned Inwood. They got their eyes set on Elizabeth Street Garden, and they rezoned for a tech hub without building in protections for University Place. I mean, it is the wholesale giveaway of Manhattan is what we've witnessed, and going along for the ride has been many of my competitors. In fact, they're responsible for it. So if you want a real change, you've got to bring in an outsider. You've got to bring in somebody who's willing to call out the mayor, who's willing to call out the city council, who's willing to stand up for our neighborhoods, stand up for our small businesses, and that is what I'm going to do.
All right, we'll leave it there. David Eisenbach, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Ben.